This was not the death anyone had anticipated for a king: a broken body, excruciating agony, and an odour so foul that it caused fainting. One of the most dreaded kings in history, Henry VIII, had a hideous and tragic end to his life, which we are revealing today by removing the velvet curtain. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. In his early years, he wasn't expected to inherit the throne. His older brother Arthur was the designated heir, but fate intervened. Arthur died suddenly in 1502, and with his death, the crown shifted to young Henry. From that moment on, England placed all its hope in this vibrant, brilliant boy. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, at just 17 years old, the nation rejoiced. He was everything a Renaissance monarch was supposed to be. Tall, over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with striking red-gold hair, a chiseled face, and a dazzling smile. Henry was a vision of regal perfection. He was athletic, scholarly, charming, and well-versed in theology, music, languages, and diplomacy. He spoke Latin fluently, dabbled in poetry, and composed music. He hunted with skill, jousted with reckless courage, and danced with noble grace. A Venetian ambassador once declared he had an angel's face and the body of a god. European courts whispered his name with admiration. England had a golden prince on the throne, and it seemed nothing could tarnish his reign. But power and youth are fleeting, and destiny can be cruel. The beginning of Henry's slow, gruesome unraveling came in January 1536, the moment that changed everything. At 44 years old, Henry was still clinging to the image of his younger self. Determined to prove he hadn't lost his strength or virility, he entered a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, one of his favorite sports. But something went horribly wrong. During the match, his massive armored horse stumbled and collapsed mid-charge directly onto the king. Henry was thrown violently to the ground, his full weight encased in steel, and crushed beneath his equally armored steed. Witnesses rushed to his side. He was unconscious, not for a minute or two, but for 2 full hours. Those standing nearby feared the worst. They thought the king was dead. When he finally came to, Henry wasn't the same. The impact had gravely injured his right leg, and despite the efforts of Tudor physicians, the wound would never heal. It became an open, festering ulcer, deep, raw, and infected. Every attempt to treat it only made things worse. Doctors tried cauterization, poultices made of herbs and dung, and frequent lancing to drain the pus. Nothing worked, and as weeks turned into months, and months into years, the ulcer only grew more putrid. The leg would swell grotesquely, turning red, then purple, and in its later stages, black with gangrene. The stench was legendary. It was said you could smell Henry before you saw him. Servants reportedly carried sweet-smelling herbs and cloths to press against their faces when entering his chambers. Ambassadors wrote home that the king's leg emitted a foulness that overcame all present. The once athletic and agile monarch could barely walk. Eventually, he couldn't walk at all. He needed to be hoisted by a system of ropes and pulleys just to move from his bed. But this wasn't just a physical decline. It marked the beginning of Henry's mental and emotional decay. Pain became a constant companion, and with it came paranoia, rage, and irrational cruelty. The charismatic Renaissance prince gave way to a monstrous tyrant. Those closest to him began to fear his moods. His decisions grew erratic. His punishments became swift and merciless. And somewhere in the midst of all this suffering, Henry VIII began to rot, not only on the outside, but from deep within his very soul. This wasn't just physically painful, it was psychologically devastating for a king whose very identity was built on his image. Henry VIII had once been the embodiment of Renaissance masculinity, a radiant, chiseled monarch in jewel-toned silks, galloping on horseback, leading hunts, dazzling ladies at court, and dancing until sunrise. But now, he was reduced to a groaning, festering mass of pain, wheeled from chamber to chamber like a bloated invalid. For a man obsessed with power, virility, and control, this was more than a medical tragedy. It was a personal apocalypse. The smell alone was legendary. Courtiers and foreign envoys were forced to endure the nauseating stench of his suppurating leg ulcers in total silence. Speaking of the king's declining health, or even wrinkling one's nose in his presence, was considered treason. Men who had fought in wars and faced swords without flinching fainted in his presence, not from fear, but from the putrid air that clung to him like a cloak. Henry became increasingly withdrawn and mistrustful. His chambers were kept sealed. His medical treatments were conducted in secret. Some accounts suggest that his bed linens had to be changed multiple times a day due to the foul discharge from his wounds. The king, who once bathed in rosewater and wore robes of gold, now sat in pools of his own bodily decay. But it wasn't just his leg that festered, it was his mind. The year of the accident, 1536, marked a horrifying transformation in his personality. That same year, Henry accused Anne Boleyn, his brilliant and ambitious second wife, of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that historians almost unanimously agree were fabricated. Anne, once the apple of his eye, the woman for whom he had torn England from the Pope's grip, was now an object of scorn. She was executed by sword, an unusual mercy Henry allowed only because of foreign diplomats watching. Was it mere coincidence that the sudden destruction of Anne Boleyn came months after his brain was rattled and his body shattered? Many historians don't think so. Some scholars speculate that Henry suffered traumatic brain injury during the fall. He was unconscious for 2 hours, long enough for serious internal damage. Modern neurologists suggest symptoms consistent with frontal lobe damage, impulsiveness, mood swings, paranoia, and violent outbursts. Others believe the repeated concussions he suffered over years of jousting contributed to what we might today diagnose as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, the same degenerative brain disease seen in modern athletes subjected to repeated blows to the head. And then there was the weight. Oh, the weight. As he to move diminished, so did any semblance of restraint in his lifestyle. Once a svelte, armor-clad knight with a 34-inch waist, 89 centimeter, Henry ballooned into a massive figure requiring tailored clothes measuring over 51 inches at the waist, 103 centimeters. Some sources estimate he weighed more than 400 pounds, over 180 kilograms, in his later years. At court events, where once he led the dance, he now sat on an enormous reinforced throne, barely able to stand. Servants had to engineer a custom-made pulley system just to hoist him onto horseback or into his bath. Palaces were retrofitted with wider doorways and reinforced furniture. His armor had to be remade, twice. Even his royal beds had to be rebuilt to accommodate his ever-expanding frame, and while his body was collapsing, his appetite only grew more monstrous. Henry VIII ate like a man trying to fill a hole that could never be satisfied. He devoured roasted boar, swan, venison, lamb, duck, and goose, lavishly prepared and drowned in gravies and sauces. He consumed entire pies stuffed with whole birds, meats layered like lasagna, and gallons of ale, red wine, and mead with each meal. He was known to eat up to 14 courses in a single sitting. Records estimate he consumed at least 5,000 calories per day, though some believe it may have been closer to double that. And vegetables? Please. To Henry, vegetables were for peasants. His meals contained little to no fiber or nutrition outside of animal fat and starch. His stools were reportedly the size of cannonballs and equally painful to pass, leading to frequent constipation, internal hemorrhoids, and possibly even bowel impaction. His medical records from the time are filled with notes of excess gas, indigestion, and black bile. No exercise, no vegetables, no restraint, no mercy. All of this contributed to an accelerated decay that seemed to defy human biology. His leg grew so infected it said you could see the bone through the rotting flesh. The stench traveled through corridors, and the pus leaked through his clothes. His teeth blackened, his gums bled, and his breath reeked of rot. Yet no one dared tell him. His doctors flinched but lied. His advisors choked down vomit but bowed. His wives smiled, at least the ones who survived. This was a man who was rotting, alive, and the kingdom watched in paralyzed horror. Doctors of the era did what they could, which honestly made things worse. They burned his wounds with hot irons, slathered them with arsenic and mercury, and drained his blood regularly. His leg ulcers got so bad you could see bone through rotting flesh, the smell detectable from 3 rooms away. At 49, Henry married 19-year-old Catherine Howard. He called it a return to youth. Everyone else called it horrifying. Unable to stomach her monstrous husband, Catherine had an affair. Henry had her and her lover executed. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was more nurse than spouse. She cared for him faithfully, despite knowing what had happened to his previous partners. By this point, Henry was a walking medical disaster. Diabetes, gout, heart failure, and possibly syphilis. His final years were a nightmare. He alternated between screaming rages and depressive silence. His paranoia exploded. He executed friends, loyal advisors, even family. No one was safe. Notably, he had Henry Howard beheaded just 9 days before his own death. Obsessed with being poisoned, he made servants taste every meal and inspected utensils with military precision. This might have been from increasing mental instability, or perhaps the result of minor strokes. As the end neared, things got truly hellish. He could barely move. Gangrene consumed his legs. The odor was so overpowering that courtiers wore perfumed cloths over their faces. Yet none dared say he was dying. It was considered treason, and just like that ulcer on Henry's leg, you can't ignore this next part. Click that subscribe button before we execute your chance to escape this grotesque royal drama. Between the waning months of 1546 and the bleak dawn of 1547, Henry VIII, once the golden lion of England, fell apart piece by piece. His body, bloated and diseased, betrayed him. The leg ulcers that had plagued him for over a decade had tunneled deep into the muscle, blackened with infection. His breath was sour, his skin pallid and waxy, and his speech, when it came, was slurred and confused. He was gripped by fevers that left him soaked in his own sweat, muttering and delirious. His courtiers began whispering that the king was not just ill, he was dying. At night he thrashed and wept, calling out in his sleep. Servants claimed they heard him murmur the names of his dead wives, most often Jane Seymour, the pure one who gave him his son, and even, they whispered, Anne Boleyn, the woman he had falsely condemned to death. Some believed Anne's ghost haunted him. Others claimed he saw visions, phantoms of his beheaded friends, wives and rivals, come to drag him to hell. Then, on January 27, 1547, as his breathing grew shallow and his skin turned the color of candle wax, Henry summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, his old ally in the English Reformation. But by the time Cranmer arrived, the once mighty king could no longer speak. All Henry could manage was to grip the archbishop's hand, a final desperate squeeze to signal his faith, one last show of piety from a man who had once made himself head of his own church. Hours later, at the age of 55, Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of Ireland, supreme head of the Church of England, destroyer of monasteries, beheader of queens, died. But even in death, his body would not go quietly. Because of his enormous size, a specially reinforced coffin had to be built, longer and wider than anything made before. But even that wasn't enough. In the 16th century, embalming was still primitive. The process mostly involved gutting the corpse and stuffing it with herbs and cloth, a crude attempt to slow the rot. But Henry VIII was no ordinary corpse. As the days passed, gases from decomposition began to build up inside the royal carcass, turning it into a ticking time bomb of rot and pressure. The stench was unbearable. His coffin, which had been sealed and paraded to lie in state at Sion Abbey, began to leak, and not just a little. Putrid black bodily fluids burst through the wood, dripping onto the stone floor of the chapel. And then, because reality is more grotesque than fiction, stray dogs found their way into the chapel and licked the royal fluids off the ground. Yes, you heard that right. Street dogs slurped up the liquefied remains of Henry VIII. Contemporary chroniclers like Gilbert Burnet later recorded the event, and even if the detail was embellished by Henry's enemies, it stuck. The image of England's mightiest king, reduced to a leaking bag of royal juice, being consumed by mongrels. It was the final humiliation. A man who had ruled with iron will, who had demanded godlike reverence, who had styled himself the very image of majesty, reduced to putrefaction and disgrace. Yet despite the grotesque condition of the body, the show had to go on. Henry's funeral, delayed by nearly 3 weeks, was finally held on February 16, 1547. His coffin was transported to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, its base soaked with leaking fluids. Attendees, gagging from the smell, did their best to maintain composure as incense burned in thick clouds to cover the odor of rot. He was interred beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had died while still in Henry's good graces, and, crucially, the only one to give him what he wanted most, a son. But that long-awaited son, Edward VI, frail and sickly, would die at just 15 years old, leaving behind no heirs. The dynasty Henry had torn England apart to secure crumbled before it could take root. Then came Mary the Fur, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who would spend her reign trying to undo her father's religious reforms, burning Protestants at the stake and plunging the kingdom into terror. And finally, to the throne rose Elizabeth the Fee, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry had loved, destroyed, and perhaps, in death, remembered with regret. The ultimate irony. Henry's true legacy, England's golden age, would not come from the son he obsessed over, but from the daughter of the wife he beheaded. In the end, Henry's grotesque decline wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was symbolic. He had once defied popes, rewritten religion, beheaded anyone who defied him, and molded England in his own image. But all the power in the world could not stop his flesh from rotting, rupturing, and spilling onto the floors of a sacred chapel. His death was more than a medical disaster. It was a brutal allegory of fallen majesty, of how absolute power, when left unchecked, turns not into glory, but into decay. As historian Alison Weir put it, it is one of the great paradoxes of history that a man who began with so much promise, beauty, and ability ended as a grotesque caricature of himself. Tormented, unloved, isolated, Henry became a walking cautionary tale, a living testament to how vanity, gluttony, paranoia, and rage can twist even the most golden boy into something monstrous. His policies reshaped England forever, but his body, once admired by poets and painters, became a gory reminder of what time, illness, and ambition can do to even the greatest among us. His portraits still hang in museums, showing a powerful, majestic king clad in jewels and ermine. But the truth behind the canvas was a man who reeked of death, wept for lost wives, and leaked his way into history. Thus ended Henry VIII, not with triumph, but with a stench that filled chapels and a puddle that fed stray dogs. The king who remade a kingdom in the end became a symbol of the very rot he once tried to rule over. Click on this video to uncover a royal scandal even darker than Henry's.